Ubuntu and Raspberry Pi go together like Marmite and Peanut Butter. I'm not entirely sure that joke travels, but anyway, the popular single-board computer supports several Linux distros and has recently made it much easier to install Ubuntu than ever before. Hi, this is Phil from Make Tech Easier, and this is how to install Ubuntu on a Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi supports several Linux distributions. Most of the time you just need to flash the system image onto an SD card, insert that SD card into a Raspberry Pi and start running it. However, this doesn't apply for Ubuntu. Installing Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi used to be a chore, with the need to create an Ubuntu SSO account before first downloading the Ubuntu core image. Luckily, with the release of the Raspberry Pi Imager tool, installing Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi is now very easy. You'll learn in this video how to flash an Ubuntu image to your Raspberry Pi. Introducing the Raspberry Pi Imager. In March 2020, the official Raspberry Pi Foundation released the Raspberry Pi Imager tool. This is a straightforward tool that downloads a list of various operating systems that you can use with your Raspberry Pi. Simply select an image from the list and the Raspberry Pi Imager will read the relevant files from the Foundation's website and write them directly to your SD card without you having to worry about sourcing the correct system image and downloading it to your hard drive. Let's look at how we can use this tool to install Ubuntu on your Raspberry Pi. If you haven't already, head over to the Raspberry Pi Foundation's website and download the correct version of the Raspberry Pi Imager for your operating system. Once the Raspberry Pi Imager is installed, insert your SD card into your laptop or computer. Launch the Raspberry Pi Imager application. Click Choose OS. The Imager will now retrieve and display information about the various operating systems that are compatible with Raspberry Pi. Since you want to install Ubuntu, select Ubuntu. Now you can choose from the latest LTS long-term support, Ubuntu server images, or the Ubuntu core images. You can just refer to the list on the software and that will tell you exactly what's available. Just make sure you select an image that's compatible with your specific model of Raspberry Pi and you should be fine. Once you've made your choice, click Choose SD card and select the SD card where you want to write your system image. Now the only thing left to do is to click Write and wait for the Raspberry Pi Imager to write the system image to your SD card. This takes some time. Configure Ubuntu to connect to Wi-Fi automatically. Next, edit the Ubuntu system image on the SD card so that the Pi connects to the Wi-Fi network automatically. Make sure your SD card is inserted in your laptop or computer, launch a File Manager application and go to the SD card folder. Open the System Boot partition, as this contains the configuration files that will be loaded when the Raspberry Pi boots. Open the network-config file in a text editor. Now find the Wi-Fi's section and uncomment everything inside this section by removing the hash symbols at the beginning of each line. The Wi-Fi section should now look similar to this. You'll need to update access points to reference the name of your Wi-Fi network. If this name contains any spaces, make sure you surround it with quotation marks. Next, replace S3KR1T, whatever that means, with the password for your own Wi-Fi network. Now save this file and safely eject the SD card from your laptop or computer. Now every time you boot your Raspberry Pi, it'll connect to the network automatically. Using Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi. Connect your monitor and keyboard to the Raspberry Pi and power it up. On the login screen, log into Ubuntu's default account using Ubuntu for both the name and the password. Since this default login is public knowledge, you'll be prompted now immediately to change the password to something more secure. To create a new password, follow the on-screen instructions. By now you'll notice that Ubuntu doesn't come with a graphical user interface, GUI, so you can only interact with your Raspberry Pi from the command line, which, is perfectly fine, but we'd prefer a desktop. So if you prefer to interact with your Pi in a desktop environment, then there are plenty of desktops that you can install. First of all, you should update your Raspberry Pi. Sudo apt update && sudo apt -y upgrade. Then you can install your preferred desktop environment. For example, sudo apt install kubuntu desktop, or sudo apt install lubuntu desktop, or sudo apt install xubuntu desktop. There's many others. Just do a little bit of research and you'll find out. Once you've installed your desktop environment, reboot your Pi with the following command: sudo reboot. When your Raspberry Pi reboots, the desktop environment will be ready for you to use. As you can see, the version of Ubuntu that is running is pretty familiar. All the things that you would expect to be there are there. All the apps, all the controls, all the settings, everything is pretty much as it should be. Anyone who uses Ubuntu will be perfectly comfortable with this GUI. So, As you can see, it's easy to install Ubuntu on your Raspberry Pi using the new Imager application. If you're not interested in Ubuntu, you can also install FiDOS on Raspberry Pi or just turn your Raspberry Pi into a Wi-Fi bridge. Links in the description. Okay, as always, thanks for watching. That's all for now. See you next time.